Uh-huh. Okay, we're moving straight into the contributor talks session, and we'll start with Will Graves, who's going to talk soon about distinct computational models of reading correspond to distinct but similar neural activation patterns.
Thanks. All right, so thanks to the organizers for inviting me to tell you about this study. And it was, I got help from this from Amulya Nataraj, who is a master's student in the Rutgers Business School at the time. So I wanted to start out with sort of taking seriously the question of why might cognitive neuroscience need explicit computational models of cognition. Now, of course, the title of this conference is Cognitive Computational Neuroscience, so I probably don't need to convince you that this is necessary, but I think it's worth sort of talking about, starting with the sort of big picture of why this is useful, right? So one reason is that without quantitative predictions derived from computational models, interpretation of the fMRI data ends up potentially being radically under-constrained. Now, I haven't seen a lot of sort of standard univariate fMRI analyses at this conference, but they do still exist, and they're used all the time. And one example of this, and at least in my field of the brain basis of reading, is when people contrast words with pronounceable non-words. Okay, so one question you can ask about this is, for which of these conditions would greater semantic activation, that is, activation related to word meanings, be expected? Okay, so you could argue that if your non-words are, good, you can see my pointer. If your non-words are, legal in English, and they have, legal letter strings, then the main way that they differ from words is in meaning, right? So words are meaningful, non-words aren't by definition, like blork, for example. You can pronounce it, but it doesn't mean anything. So perhaps if you take the activation for words and you subtract out the activation from non-words, you would have left over activations for semantics, okay? But you could also argue, and people have, that, well, maybe when people see the pronounceable non-words, these pseudo-words, they're just sort of searching their semantic space to try to find some meaning for it, and that's what's going to be reflected in the fMRI data, okay? So how many people think, this contrast would yield, a picture of semantic activation that is greater for words? Just show of hands. I teach undergraduates all the time, so you guys can do this too. Some of you, yeah, okay. All right, how about non-words, pseudo-words? Who thinks that they're going to show more semantic activation? All right, a few, a handful, okay. All right, so let's see what the data show. So here's one example study from years ago, and they did this contrast, and hot colors are for words, and cool colors are for non-words, pseudo-words. And so they did the study, and they found these areas, and they interpreted the hot colors as relating to semantics, okay? A few years later, we did the same kind of study, same task, same contrast, and we found those areas that they found activated for words were suddenly, in our study, activated for non-words. So if you interpret this as semantics, and then you get activation here, but it's for meaningless non-words, what's going on, right? So I would argue that, this has included the angular gyrus, which some groups think is very much related to word-level semantics. Now, the majority of my talk today is not going to be about semantics, but I give you this as an example of how at least the field of cognitive neuroscience is done in fMRI, badly needs some quantitative models to make principled predictions that can be tested rather than just sort of telling an intuitive story about what you expect to see based on what you tried to control in your different conditions. Okay. So it's an example. For this current study, we're actually asking a question not related to semantics, but rather about how the brain represents words and their components, other aspects of words, particularly in the task of reading aloud. Okay. So reading aloud, just taking individual words and reading them one after another, that involves, first of all, their visual, so decoding the letter strings in terms of their orthography, all right? And then since the task is to read them out loud, you pronounce them one by one, then you're going to ultimately activate phonology to be able to say the words, okay? So let's, I don't know, I can't really have you all sign a consent form right now, but let's pretend that we're in the fMRI scanner, and I'm going to show you how the task works, okay? It's really simple. So I'm going to show you individual words, and you just read them out loud, all right? This is interactive, so I won't make the I'll spare you the scanner noise, but otherwise, let's pretend we're there. Okay, so what's this word? Great. All right. Okay, so, and then they see fixation in between trials. So it took you a little bit longer to say washed than cache and hash. So wash is inconsistent in terms of its spelling sound mappings. Okay, so we've quantified this as a continuous variable. We didn't invent this, people do this all the time, where the ASH in this case is mostly pronounced ash, but in the case of wash, it's pronounced osh. All right, so friend minus enemies, hash and cache are enemies of wash because they're pronounced differently. Okay, so that's one of our measures. So we have an existing model that has accounted for the cognitive processes that we think are involved in mapping from letters to sound. So in English, even though most words are regular in this letter-sound mapping, there are words like wash and so that are irregular, and we have to account for those to figure out how we are able to pronounce them from their printed form. Okay, so there's an existing computational model of reading from way back in 1996 that accounts for this pretty well, and it starts with, again, with orthographic input. So let's take the word ship. All right, so it's just the visual form. It maps it to the hidden unit layers. In this case, there's 100 hidden units because that's just what they discovered worked well. And that ultimately maps to the phonological output where the sequence of phonemes is encoded for production. Okay. So we're focusing on the hidden unit layer, which is what really does, of course, the computation in this input-output mapping. Okay. So you might sometimes have irregular words as well, like the word so, okay? So the question is, how does it do these? And the answer is, for other cases, it would help to know something about its semantics. We're not going to deal with semantics today, but even a hidden unit layer without semantics is able to some extent to sort of cluster these in different areas of the space to be able to ultimately map to the right pronunciation for so. Okay. So we trained this, according to Plowton College from back in 1996, with standard backprop on a corpus of almost 3,000 monosyllabic English words. And the model got about 97% correct, which is roughly human level. Okay. The pseudo words were slightly less than human level correct responses. And so we're sort of working on that, but we would argue it's sort of close enough to move on to get compare this to the fMRI data. So I also want to say just a little bit about what we think the model learned. So we did a principal components analysis after training, once it's fully trained, on the hidden unit layer, and just to give a kind of intuition about how the model does this input-output mapping. Okay, so I just highlighted a few items in this space. So it learns the pronunciation of words that share onset, like rate and race, and words that share offset, bleat and treat. Okay, and it will code a combination of onset and offset. So silk and milk both end in ilk, well and weld, start with the well sound. And there's also, it can deal with irregular or inconsistent words like our, poor, and ghoul by sort of mapping them in this sort of blend of orthographic and phonological patterns, and the same thing with sword and word. Okay, so even though it doesn't have semantics, and semantics might help, it's still able to make this, to learn this mapping. Okay, so that's one concept, but there's a very different model out there. So this model was actually an answer to an older sort of school of thought that's computationally implemented in this dual root cascaded model of reading from Coulthard and colleagues. It also starts with orthography, like ship, for example, to take the same example of the visual word form. And it maps it onto a set of grapheme, phoneme, letter sound correspondence rules. These are explicit rules. They're not learned. They're hand-coded by the experimenters. And there happen to be 2,033 of them. Who knew? And then it takes that and maps them right onto phonology, okay, for output, like ship. For words like so, that are irregular, it looks them up in an orthographic lexicon. Okay, I have 2,998 here because that's just how many words there were in the other model. So there's an entry for every word. And once you've looked it up in the orthographic lexicon, so you have a little entry for so in your orthographic lexicon, then that maps onto the corresponding phonological form to pronounce it. Okay, and then eventually that goes to final output. So people have argued for years about which one is right, because they're very different conceptions of how reading might work. There's these explicit rules and lexicons, and then there's the statistical regularities that you get from an artificial neural network. So just like we focused on the hidden unit layer in the previous model, we're going to focus on the intermediate layers, rules and lexicons for this model, and try to eventually map those to the brain. So let me just say that both of these models, people have tried for years to get them behaviorally to be distinguished, and it turns out they're both really well supported by behavioral data. And so one question then to sort of give you some expectations about the neural data is to say, how are the relevant components of these models represented in the brain? So from the same data set I'm going to show you here, we previously, years ago, analyzed it in a univariate way. And so it's almost like pre-registering our results, except that it's a different kind of analysis. And so there's these letter and sound areas, and a combination of them are expected to be able to map from letters to sound, and perhaps these areas are mapping through some intermediate layer. Okay, and this both is the result of the univariate analyses of this data set and also the literature. Okay. So we took these models and we used representational similarity analysis to sort of find out, not just from a univariate point of view, but directly from these computational models, how they map onto neural systems. And it's a nice tool. I tried for years to get this to work before RSA was around, but RSA solves the problem for us because it obviates the issue of deciding how to put models and the brain data in the same space. That was always the problem before. These models look different from the brain. How do you get them to line up? Well, RSA solves that nicely by creating a similarity space that is in the same stimulus by stimulus dimensions. So then you take those stimuli and you have vector representations, and then you can just see how those are correlated, and you make a stimulus by stimulus matrix. Okay. So we had 18 participants reading 464 words aloud, just like you all did a few minutes ago. And they're a subset of the total words that were learned by the model. We scanned on a 3 TGE scanner in a rapid event-related design, and so because it was rapid event-related, we had to deconvolve to estimate the neural events. And again, these were the univariate version of this was published previously. Okay, so RSA on the intermediate representations now. Okay, so this is, I'm going to show you representational dissimilarity matrices for the hidden units from the artificial neural network model, and the intermediate, the rules and lexicons from the DRC model. Okay, so here's what it looks like. We've ordered the stimuli, the words, by level of spelling sound consistency, and there's definitely some structure here. You can see sort of little clusters of similarity and dissimilarity as you go along. The question is this going to be similar or different from the other model? And it turns out it's actually pretty, broadly pretty similar. You get this sort of structure here, and it shows up in the same place here, and this little thing down here. And so you can, the nice thing is now these are in the same space, you can check, and sure enough, they're correlated at about 0.5. So I just want to pause and say, ever since Seidenberg and McClellan threw down the gauntlet in 1989 and said, no, we don't need rules and lexicons. This can be learned by a single system through the sensitivity to the statistics of the language. They've been arguing about this, and it turns out they're arguing over something that's actually correlated at about 0.5. It's pretty similar, even though the theories that go into these representations are radically different. Okay, so let's just zoom in a little bit and see where the models show similarities and differences in how they're treating the words. So you can see, for example, here, spill and pill are quite similar, and that's true for the neural network model as well as for the rule-based model, right? And same thing with spill and skill, right? So they agree there, I would argue. There's a little bit of disagreement here. So chat and hack are relatively similar. So cool, they're dissimilarity matrices, so cool colors are more similar. Whereas the DRC model, chat and hack are pretty different. So they agree in some places and not in others. Perhaps the neural network model is a little more sensitive to sort of higher order, non-obvious similarities, but still there's sort of broad agreement, I would say. All right. So now, now we're going to take these matrices and we're going to do searchlight across the cortex, where the model-based representations are replaced with neural activations in the representation vector, and we're going to compare the matrices. Okay. So here's what you get for the left hemisphere, and it's a lot of the same areas. Again, this is for the neural network model. It's a lot of the same areas you see in the univariate analysis, but some are different. So we didn't expect this anterior temporal lobe thing, so that's surprising a bit. But this sort of ventral temporal occipital stuff and a little bit of ventral inferior frontal is pretty, it sort of makes intuitive sense that these would be areas that would be mapping from letters to sound. When I submitted this for the conference, I'd only analyzed the left hemisphere. Then I got a new grad student, Ryan Staples, who came to me from Haskins Labs and already had some relevant skills. And I said, hey, Ryan, here's my scripts. Why don't you analyze this, but then do both hemispheres to make sure we didn't miss anything really important in the right hemisphere, and also make sure I didn't screw something up. So he reanalyzed it, and he got the same answer I did, which is reassuring. And he added the right hemisphere, and there was very little, actually, which is also a little bit reassuring, right? I mean, this is a very languagey task. It's kind of not that surprising that there's more action in the left hemisphere. So it was a sort of nice confirmation. We also zoomed in on the fusiform gyrus because there's all this literature on how word recognition happens along the ventral stream. And we got some anterior ventral stuff, which agrees with like Stanislas Dehaene's ideas about word recognition. So how does this compare to the DRC model, right? So left hemisphere, they also get this anterior temporal lobe thing, which again surprised me some. Not as much ventral temporal occipital, and also not much right hemisphere. But when you zoom in on the fusiform gyrus, there's also activation in that model there, and it's a little more anterior than the one for the artificial neural network. Okay. So what about the contrast? What if you directly compare these two? They're correlated at 0.5. Are there going to be any differences? Well, the answer is no, not at a first pass. We didn't see any significant differences. Now, if you lower the threshold a little bit, which I realize you have to be careful about that, but we lowered it from 0.001 voxel-wise to 0.005, just for exploratory to give you a sense of the pattern. And this area emerged. It's the same area that was present in the univariate analysis for spelling sound consistency. So cool colors is less consistency, more irregular, the more activation. And when you look at patients who've had stroke and they can no longer pronounce these irregular words like so, they say sue instead of so, right? So that's surface dyslexia. You've acquired surface dyslexia from brain damage, and you can overlay those areas of brain damage leading to surface dyslexia with this fMRI result, and you see the overlap in yellow is the same area you get for spelling sound consistency in the model, which is kind of cool. All right, so wrapping up, statistical regularities captured by the ANN model seem to relate to spelling sound consistency measures for words. This is shown by neural evidence from direct comparison with the DRC model, which is preliminary because we had to lower the threshold, so who knows, we'll see if it survives. And spatial correspondence with brain areas showing greater activation for low consistency words. It also shows necessity because it corresponds spatially to areas where damage leads to surface dyslexia, pronouncing so like Sue. And more generally, the results demonstrate the promise of directly comparing cognitive computational models in terms of neural data, which I don't have to convince you guys of, as well as constraining interpretation of fMRI data to reveal cognitive interpretations of neural computations. And in the future, we really are gonna implement semantics as well. We have concrete plans to do that. In fact, we just submitted an NSF grant for that in August, so if there are any reviewers in the room, please be kind. And I'll just acknowledge my lab, our funding, NIH funding, and also Rutgers University startup funds. Ryan Staples helped me with some of these analyses, and thank you. Questions at all? Well, I guess that took all 20 minutes. Oh, there's one, yeah.
This probably is the most useful or cool question. So when you were training your neural net with about 3,000 corresponding words, you said there was high accuracy for trained words, but that for pseudo words there was a lower kind of between 60 and 70%. How do you decide, I might have missed something, how do you decide the correct orthography for pseudo words, or are they all kind of regular?
Right, so yeah, I will. So that's a great question. So the question was, for pseudo words, how do you determine the right representations? So you said orthography. Well, the orthography is easy because it's just the visual form, but the real challenge is the phonology. That's right. So how do you know? So we assume that the pseudo words follow the sort of regular patterns, right? So it would be weird to pronounce a pseudo word as if it were some sort of irregular word, but there could be alternative reasonable pronunciations for pseudo words as well, and you just sort of go through the list and count them right by intuition. So that actually is something we have to do still. Yeah, thank you. Yep, thank you.